As we struggle today with COVID-19, with protests in over 140 cities in America, even other countries, and with the normal stresses of daily life, I want us to look again at God's will. I stand here on these steps looking into the church, remembering that we began this series with a brief overview, saying we'd look at God's will in 4 pieces. The first piece, when we talked about how the rhythms and the miracles of creation show us God's intended will for humanity and creation, that it's intended to be a life of rhythm and relationships where we live and love the way God intends for all. In part 2, we discussed God's will for man's will, which means God gives humans the free will to choose. This gives us the ability to choose, and ability to respond accordingly, our responsibility, which is that we use our free will for good. But our free will can also be used for selfish things, sometimes so selfish and reckless the effects can be devastating. In the late 1930s and 40s, Leslie Weatherhead was a Methodist pastor in England. Very early one morning during the war, when the sirens finally turned off after a long night of bombing, Weatherhead could see that Hitler's Luftwaffe squadrons had destroyed City Temple Church in London. Weatherhead condensed so many of his questions into the broad topic of God's circumstantial will. But I believe we must distinguish between man's free will to choose and God's intervening will that may even alter man's choices sometimes. Dividing it like this helps us to not only miss some of God's most important actions in history and life. Since God allows us humans to choose, God's very best for us may sometimes be lost amidst our very worst. Some might say no one should be allowed to go against the will of God. But we must remember that if God grants humans the ability to do good, he must grant equal ability to do bad. And so all of humanity, to varying degrees, have exercised our free will to do things ranging from completely selfish all the way to utterly selfless. When choices become so selfish toward one person, or a few, that they become reckless toward many, like in the 1930s and 40s, when we saw a race of people being exterminated, victims will beg for someone to intervene, for someone who can and who will change things. Christians have for 2,000 years clung to the belief that the mighty Roman Empire exercised its free will to snuff out the life of Jesus by repeated brutal beatings, followed by history's worst form of execution, crucifixion on a wooden cross. Christians have held even tighter to the one explanation why Jesus could have been killed, and yet his movement still exists today with a church like this. The conviction that God did intervene and did raise Jesus' lifeless body from the dead into a new dimension of life and reality. Now, of course, that begs us to ask, if God intervened there, then what about the minivan crash with no survivors? Or what about my loved one who was dying of cancer, or another who's living with a chronic and painful disease? Surely God could have intervened in those and many other situations. Those are very important questions. While we can't today fully explain C.S. Lewis's problem of pain, or adequately address Rabbi Kushner's issue of when bad things happen to good people, we can and will cover that type of question in 2 weeks after this series concludes. It suffices to say for now that there are times when God has intervened and has changed things, not only with Easter, but also with Moses and the Red Sea, not only with the Old Testament and New Testament stories like Daniel or the fiery furnace, blind Bartimaeus or Lazarus, but so many more. In page after page of history, we find people knocked down but not out, many who have been beaten but not defeated, because they claim the faith that God still intervenes and still changes things. When villages, nations, even the world has wondered if there was any hope, one of God's people has leaned forward and whispered, there is always hope. Martin Luther's confidence that God is a mighty fortress, alongside John Wesley's and Isaac Watts's versions of "O God, our help in ages past," echo the original Psalm 90. 3,000 years earlier, that song had been penned by King David. Some say there's an earlier version by Moses, meaning it could be the oldest psalm ever recorded. But no matter what, they are all a confident proclamation that while life may sometimes look bleak, God's intervening will always gives hope.
Shelter from the stormy blast, and